Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. This is Tim Buntel speaking, coming to you from XebiaLabs, where we're really delighted that you were able to join us for another great webinar to talk about DevOps and how it can have some really important impact in your organization. We're delighted to be joined by Rob Stroud from Forrester Research today. And Rob, if you can share your screen. We'll get the slides up, and I'll go through a bit of quick information before we turn it over to you to walk through. There we go. Great. So today, we've been having a lot of conversations over the last couple of months about scaling DevOps. So we're going to go really deep on that conversation today, specifically looking at business velocity and quality. A couple of brief housekeeping points up at the front. We are going to record this presentation, so don't worry about taking screenshots or frantically writing notes. We're going to put links to the slides and the recording on our website after the presentation. We also have built time in for Q&A and conversation at the end. So we'd love for you to use the GoToWebinar control panel over on the side. You'll see a questions section. You can go over there and type in some questions there as we're going through the content, and we'll have some time to draw from those at the end, as well as a few questions that we already have. So again, just to quickly turn over to some introductions. My name's Tim Buntel. I'm really delighted, as I said, to join you most months to have these conversations, look after the product group here at XebiaLabs, and really delighted to be inviting as a guest speaker today Rob Stroud, who's Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. We spent a lot of great time talking to Rob about XebiaLabs and how we fit into the DevOps world, and we're delighted to have your thoughts today, Rob, on other folks' enterprise organizations and the impact there. So I'll turn it over to you, and I'll be back and forth in and out from time to time, but mostly I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks everybody for joining us today. My name's Rob Stroud, Principal Analyst at Forrester, as Tim said, and I've been looking at this domain here at Forrester for most of the last 2 years and looking at how DevOps is emerging and evolving. And one of the interesting things that every one of you today will share with me is that the focus has really transitioned in most enterprises from simply cutting costs to speed. Recently, I was with the CIO of a large financial organization, and the CIO had a team meeting, a direct report meeting, and the team said that we actually have to go fast. We are being challenged in the market by startups, by fintechs, by organizations who just use technology and drive evolution and drive it quickly. We need to not deliver in every 6 months. We need to probably deliver every 6 minutes, although it's probably a bit slower than that. The reality is we need to focus on speed and being fast. Now, in a recent Forrester survey, we surveyed people about what they thought about release velocity. And surprisingly or surprisingly not, 64% of business respondents identified that they were very dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied with their release velocity. It is clear that we need to get stuff done, we need to get code to production, and we need to get it there quickly because the business today is extremely reactive in terms of how fast it wants to go. Now, if you want to see where we're going, we actually have some good success. Now, we recently did some research that looked at how quickly organizations were deploying. And the good news is that organizations are really starting to get into a monthly cadence. The ability to deliver monthly, in fact, there's a sub-data point under here that says that 8% of organizations are actually delivering daily now. But if you look at it, we are really changing from where we were just a few years ago to deploying on a 3-monthly or a 6-monthly basis for those huge releases with lots of issues and challenges that would happen and failures that would happen, to really delivering on a monthly basis. And that cadence is kind of very accepted with organizations. You can see here that about 20% of organizations globally now, depending on your business type, it varies a little bit, are actually delivering monthly and deploying monthly. So we are getting there, and that's a good thing. And organizations, and this is the stats that I love, organizations that actually deploy faster, you would think that there's a relating decrease in quality. Well, it's interesting that organizations that do more frequent code deployments, and that's really getting deployments down to daily or weekly or less, and faster time to commit deployments, they are also seeing more quantitative, qualitative measures as well. That means that when they do have a failure, they are recovering significantly faster, and that failure is also happening less often, and changes are failing about 1/5 in this new world of when they failed in the Big Bang world, the world where you packaged up releases, did loads and loads of stuff, and threw it out on an irregular basis. So one of the things we learned, which is directly proportional to smaller changes that are well tested, that are moved through a consistent pipeline on consistent infrastructure, is that the outcome of this is that you will decrease your change failure rate, which means that you have less defects, which means that you are spending less time on rework, more time on innovation. You are driving the business faster. And that is the key reason why DevOps is supporting and driving business transformation. Tim, do you want to talk a bit about this case study?
Yeah, so, we're big fans of that State of DevOps report. Nicole Forsgren did a webinar with us a few months back where we talked about some of those key metrics and how they're important. We do, of course, like to look at real-world cases as well. I think lots of folks have seen these kinds of numbers, but we were lucky to have just a couple of weeks ago David Joseph, who's an automation engineer over at Paychex, talk to us about their experiences with this and how his enterprise build automation team kind of went through this transformation over the last 12 months and had some really dramatic experiences with it. That webinar is recorded and it's on our site, but basically what they were able to measure by having this same repeatable format and consistent pipeline, in their case it was Bitbucket through Jenkins, through the XebiaLabs products with deployment automation with XL Deploy and orchestration with XL Release. They were really able to increase their capacity to onboard new applications. You see there the 5x number. But interestingly, in the conversation, he was able to equate that to more than 40 full-time employees. And I know from going out and speaking to lots of organizations that hiring people that have good skills and abilities to help get applications into production, there's a real shortage of that. So a real benefit of this, of being able to have the equivalent of other full-time employees, is you're able to do that even when there might be a labor shortage, right? And then speaking to quality, finally, David did point out that all 100% of deployment failures that they had seen related to configuration inconsistencies, again, speaking to that consistency point that you were just making, Rob, 100% of those were removed in this new version of their process. So really great real-world data that was coming out that backs up some of those points that you were just making.
Thanks, Tim. And I think this is a great articulation of the value prop of really putting consistent process in place and consistent experience and really driving the process through and achieving the advantages. So one of the things I'm very pleased to say is that 2017, DevOps has really reached escape velocity. It's not just that thing we talk about in the moment, that utopian state we want to get to. It really is becoming part of the business DNA. And I've already hinted that, DevOps is really just a capability or a tool or a process or all of the above that actually drives business transformation. And let's face it, we are all focused on transforming our businesses, protecting them from the unicorns that are coming to get us, and really driving through this value. So DevOps is just a technique to drive and deliver business transformation. It's a technique that's supported by people and process, by culture, and of course by tooling. And if you put all that together, you kind of get a collective picture of transformation of your organization and transformation of the way you do things in terms of how you go about doing and delivering your business-based technology. So the first thing I want to talk about, and the data we have here, is that 50% of organizations are actually implementing DevOps now. Now, if you read through this data, one of the things you see here is very few people say they're done, and that is reflective in the Forrester inquiry calls we get, where we are getting a lot of organizations. So if I go back to my 2016 data, I can tell you that 2016, I got a lot of questions about what is DevOps? What is it? where do I start and how do I start? Over the course of the year, we've seen those questions transform. And those questions are transforming from you all out there to ask us questions like, right, I've done my pilots, I've now got a kind of a handle on it, I've looked at the team structure, that kind of works, I'm pretty happy with it. Now, I really want to move forward to implementing it, moving across the whole organization. And with that shift is represented in this 50% number where we see organizations really looking to implement and then expand and go beyond just prototypes and pilots to go beyond DevOps at scale.
Yeah, we certainly hear the same, Rob. Just to chime in from our side on the software end, we used to hear a lot of should we do this, and now it's really about how should we do this, right? Questions about helping make the business case for this have been replaced with show me how to do it and what approaches can we use to make sure that we can scale that implementation up more rapidly.
And those comments are really reflected, Tim, in where we see the industry segments that DevOps is getting, what I call hotter and hotter in. Now, if you look at the DevOps heat map, which is a report we produced in May of this year, one of the things is, with the exception of government, we find DevOps is discussed significantly across all sectors. And I will tell you that over the course of this year, that public sector and healthcare has actually started to increase. But really, the reality of what's happening here is that organizations that are in the financial services area and insurance, they are truly looking to deliver DevOps now and use DevOps as a technique. Utilities and telecoms, as they go and transform their businesses, they are doing DevOps now. And in fact, across all other sectors, to some degree, you see degrees of interest and heat in DevOps today. Now, DevOps is about a balance. It's not just a culture and process. It also requires you to adjust release, which we've already hinted at. And of course, you're going to use tooling as well to drive and support that automation. But one of the key techniques and tactics that I'm going to talk about already is the fact that you really need to look at the capabilities of how you get release velocity. If you don't deliver release velocity, if you're not really getting deployments and deploys to production in a rapid process, you're really then just repeating the sins of the past. And that's really what we want to do and talk about is how we get there. One of the real challenges, though, I see in organizations, especially as I look to the deployment piece, the deployment question, is that we really have a lot of what I call silos of automation. Now, we're IT people for the main, and if you talk about it, whether you're in dev or enterprise architecture or security or risk or even ops, one of the things we kind of always do is we look to ways to automate our tasks. And organizations are typically set up in organizational silos and constructs. And typically, what we've found in our research is that you've done a really good job at automating within your silo. And one of the challenges we see is that organizations fail to automate across the full and complete life cycle. And this is really one of those traps that we really run into. It's a trap for young players, because if you're not looking holistically, you end up in a situation where you can have domain excellence, and you're hoping that domain excellence in every domain equates to domain to product excellence in the outcome. Studies show us that that's not always the case. In that if you don't have an understanding of what the end product is and the quality of the end product, you can end up with various pieces that function very, very well and others that don't. So as we move through in the destruction of the silos of automation, one of the things our research shows is if you look on the left here, you see that you've got your typical end-to-end life cycle. You've got your ability to check in your source code. You're going to build, you're going to do some testing, you're going to merge, you're going to build and release, do some acceptance testing. You're going to determine if you want to release or not. And then you want to ultimately automate that release and then, of course, do some analytics. And then, of course, we start the magic roundabout yet again. And by the way, this is a pretty proven process. It works. It does as desired. It does what it says on the tin. Our research shows that there's really some interesting points that there are some disconnects. Now, I've already touched on we automate the CI/CD pipeline. It's really interesting. We surveyed executive leadership and a number of DevOps professionals, and there's a report on that which is linked down the bottom. But if you look at that quickly, we found that executives thought that their process was automated far more than it was. We actually found that only about 42% of the CI/CD pipeline is automated across organizations that we surveyed. And that's both a disconnect in terms of management, and it's a warning sign in terms of execution. We need to look at that point, and that's the first failure point in the first of three. Then we talk to people about configuration management. Now, if you think for a moment, one of the traps for young players in terms of deployment is if you go and get your application deployment under control, but you don't look at your configuration that runs it, and you don't instrument and automate the configuration. Let's just imagine we've got 3 people in the back end in the server room, where whether they're building private or public instances, or they've got virtual private clouds or physical servers. They're busy hand building each of these servers. We have pets, we name them, we love them, we hold their hands, all that type of thing. We need to really move away from that and move to configuration management or configuration automation. And it's interesting that almost 60% of executives already believe that you've already done that. And once again, we found that only about 45% of IT pros had actually, DevOps professionals had actually done that. And we see that break down because what will happen is an organization will have this excellent testing regime, and they'll test their release and they'll get it all honky-dory. And then they'll go to production and build a net new production system that looks nothing like development. So effectively, all the testing we've done is for nothing because we've tested the application functionality, but we've not tested it running where it should be. We're going to talk more about that in a moment. And then, of course, automation to production. This is where the biggest gap is. And this is where the biggest challenge is in the industry right now. We've found in DevOps, in this quest to go fast, that operations teams haven't kept up with the deployment velocity of developers. Some great stats, and I know Diego DeLuccio, my colleague at Forrester, has just done his biannual State of Development survey, and that report should ship shortly, and I suggest you all read it when it does. But one of the things is we see a massive interest in agile and agile development, and we see it being used by about 2/3 of organizations worldwide, plus or minus a little bit. But we don't see the same happening in operations. We haven't actually understood the release velocity we're getting from development, and we're not actually deploying at that same rate. So what we really need to do is we need to automate across the whole pipeline to scale DevOps. That's where we need to go. Now, you can use different components and different pieces at different times, but we need to understand the pipeline process. We need to bring it under control. And by control, I don't mean old-fashioned control. I mean, we need to deliver a process that allows, once that developer pushes a piece of code, we need to have that whole process, including the ability to build complete releases, automated. And then we need to move into testing, where we test what that deployment looks like, and then we need to release and run. Now, agile means that we're doing this more frequently with more velocity and more veracity. And what we need to do is really split our changes up into smaller, chunked up pieces and then deploy. Because the reality of it is, the smaller you chunk that piece of change up, the smaller the component you release on a regular basis is, the easier to do the testing, the easier to understand the implications, and in case of backout, the easier it is to fall back and fail over or fail forward so that you can recover.
Yeah, I'd also throw in one more piece about that small chunking, is that it's actually better for feedback too, right? You know, if this whole process, what's going in those trucks, is all about delivering value to your customers, you need to know if that value actually was valuable to the customers. And it's much easier to understand that when you're looking at smaller pieces and measuring that impact on your market or on, you know, your customer satisfaction and that sort of thing, than waiting until you have a tremendous amount of information and you need to guess what was actually driving value for your customers. So small is good not only in the process, but in understanding the results of the process.
Tim, you put up a really good point, and we might just step on that point for a moment, if you don't mind, and talk about it. So that feedback loop, that ability to understand defects at each stage of the life cycle. I mean, one of the key points here, isn't it, Tim, that if you find a defect, a small defect in testing, you can pop it back into the developer's hands while it's fresh in their minds, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is certainly a case in security as well, right? Security as a facet of quality. Good software is secure, and secure software is good software. Same sort of thing. It's much easier to remedy those issues early on when it's still at the code level with the developers than it is to detect security problems later and have to try to patch them.
Yeah, I must tell you, when in my time as a developer, once I pushed that code out the door, I really wanted to continue on its merry path to production. And when it came back for some corrections, I was on to the next thing. So I lost so much productivity resetting my mind. So, get back into that old code base. So much opportunity there for better productive development as well.
Yeah, and changing of teams, you might have offshore teams that have changeover happening rapidly. So the tighter you can bind that opportunity to respond to the feedback, be it in terms of customer value or security or quality, means that the team is still going to have it fresh in their minds. They're going to be available. They won't have moved on, and they can react much more rapidly and with better results.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm pretty sure we'll come back to this in the Q&A. So in terms of scaling DevOps, and I mean, this is really interesting. As I already alluded to earlier, that the inquiry calls have changed this year. They've really transitioned from what is DevOps, and I'm looking forward to pulling my data from 2017 as soon as we hit January 1 and looking at what you're all asking. But I have done some preliminary look-see at the inquiry data. And the question that's coming up now is, how do I really scale DevOps? I've done my 3 pilots. I've done my proof of concept. I'm pretty comfortable with it. We've got a good team. We've implemented product teams, which I'll talk about in a moment. And, things are humming along, and now we need to scale it across the organization. How do we go and do that? So we've now got beyond DevOps being a priority. So now, how do we build a team and a community? So what the things I talk about, you've got to build a team. You've got to build to a team mentality. I like to use the Toyota example, where we make teams accountable for the product that we're going to deliver and the end-to-end value of that product. And Tim alluded to already, how do I actually articulate the value of what we're doing? We see the next step being value stream mapping to drive and remove excess. And once again, I'll talk more about that in a second. You've done your experiments, you've got your learning, you communicate. Then you're going to really transition to DevOps teams. You're going to make it a way of life. You're going to make it business as usual. And then you're going to make it enterprise scale. And, one of the aspects of enterprise scale, and we see this with organizations that are high-performing teams now, is at enterprise scale, you understand the risk and impact and implications of change. And you can actually get to a point where what you have is that you can have developers effectively push directly from their coding environment to production. Now, before we all of the security people and the compliance people get upset with that statement, I will assure you every check and balance is in place. It's just we've taken advantage of automation and automated them. So let's dig into this just a little bit more context and detail. So one of the things I see in organizations is that most bottlenecks are organizational. Now, let me share with you. So this last year, we had the Amazon S3 outage, and there's some great reports on Forrester.com on that we've written on it. A great blog by my colleague Dave Bartoletti on that, and what happened. So I was used to be in banking, and we had a failure. Let me tell you, the way we handled it, we immediately had the post-implementation review. We had the war room where everybody jumped in the war room, and we quickly fixed whatever it was that failed, and sometimes not so quickly. And then after we'd done that, we would have the pointing of the finger. Who was responsible? Who was accountable? Who? And we'd run around with all the who's, and then we'd ask what the what is. And the what is, what new manual process can we put in place to stop it happening again? What new check and balance can we have? What new process can we add? And one of the things we quickly see is that over years, if you're a large enterprise, you've got lots of these who's and what's. And if you look at them, you've got lots of ability to go through your process and reimagine or revisit the process. We see successful organizations starting their DevOps journey by really looking and doing value stream mapping, going and looking at going and having an exercise where we look at all the steps involved. We look at the handoffs, the intersection points, the various testing points, and we go and we review that, and we go and understand where these roadblocks are so that we can actually get them out. Have you got a check and balance in place that's actually not relevant anymore? It's a belt and braces check. I love using the example of, it used to be when I boarded a plane, they'd scan your boarding pass at the gate, and they do that, and then you walk onto the plane, and then what they would do is they would stop you again at the door, and they'd check all the details in your boarding pass. They'd make sure you boarded the right plane. No trust in the process at all. And then you boarded the plane and you sat down, and then they'd walk around the plane. I saw this happen just the other day, and they do yet another head count of the plane to just triple check that everybody that should be on that plane was on that plane. Now, there's probably value for all these steps, and I don't want to argue why they're done, but the reality is with technology and automation today, you could easily refine that process. And one of the things I've recently seen is that process has recently changed and transitioned now with this particular airline that I'm talking about, and finally they trust the process. You check in at the gate. It's a secure process from the gate to the plane seat, so they know that once you're on there, you can't escape on the way through. So you're on the plane, they do a quick body check without you knowing of the people that are on the plane, and they're good to go. How many processes do you have like that in your organization today? You've got multiple checks. What about the change advisory board meeting? I love this meeting. You get there and you've done all the work and you've done the testing. You have everybody around the table to discuss the change virtually or physically, and then you go and have somebody say you haven't done this or done that and you can't deploy. The reality of it is that all these checks and balances should be worked out. What about delivery of testing environments? Are you manually building testing environments? Are you not using automated configuration to deliver on the way through? The reality of it is we need to look at this, and most organizations start here by doing a value stream mapping exercise, and they will find huge competitive advantages in reducing costs. One organization I was recently with, very basic thing, they found the deployment of a full application stack on a new virtual private cloud. They took all those processes out, and by following an integrated pipeline and an integrated success story, they took that process from over 40 days down to about an hour. And by the way, they know they can get it faster. And they've done that by having an automated pipeline, by understanding all the checks and pieces, automating and instrumenting them, not losing any audit or control process at all, but automating them. For instance, you've got your source code check-in, and when you do a merge to trunk, you go and you ensure that all relevant testing is completed and undertaken. You have a release that you've built. You move that full release into your staging and testing area, integrated testing areas and regression testing and things like that. And because you've already built the release and you're testing on the release that you're going to deploy to production, you know the release process is going to work, and you release and deploy and you deliver with extreme value. So to do this requires a shift from great functional excellence to integrated product teams. Now, integrated product teams, what you're going to do in there is and an integrated product team, there are lots of great discussions about what an integrated product team looks like. We're seeing lots of different types of integrated product teams, but the reality of it is you're going to take the developers that you need, the operators that you need, the business people that you need, you're going to put them in the team, and by the way, you're going to have your QA and enterprise architecture by either be physical or virtual members of the team, and we're even seeing organizations have security and governance become part of those teams. Initially, they do it by being hands-on team members. Over time, they do it by transference of skills and delivery of security and governance tool sets to allow the team to actually code an end-to-end stack. Remember, in these days of cybersecurity and security issues, security cannot be an afterthought. Compliance and governance cannot be afterthoughts. They need to be built into the very DNA of the product and the product solution, and they need to be delivered, and you need to empower your teams to deliver those capabilities as part of the base product so that you can validate it in the testing life cycle that we saw on the previous slide. So as we deliver across product teams, and we can, of course, in Q&A talk a bit more about the success or the visibility of product teams, one of the things I want to talk about is we really need to change the way we deploy. We need to change the way we deploy, and this is an interesting transition. Now, in the past, I've spent a lot of my time in operations, a lot of my time in deployment, a lot of my time in execution. And one of the things I talk about a lot now is we really need to deploy packages rather than individual components. Now, there will be a case to deliver individual components from time to time, and that's fair enough. But the reality of it is, one of the things we are seeing organizations do now, especially if you're delivering on a cloud stack, the deployment of a particular application that you might have that runs both on-premise and the cloud may look the same or may look totally different in the cloud to on-premise. But you really need to look and build complete release packages. That needs to include infrastructure, middleware, applications, maybe your container environments, maybe your PaaS environments. And the other thing that's not up here as well is you need to also look at the ability to deliver database changes automated as well, and security components and things like that. You need to build them all into the release package. You effectively need to have a release package artifact, and then you need to move that release package in an automated manner through the testing phase, through the QA phase, and through the delivery phase. Now, in this world of rapid and consistent and continual changes, you can't do it, of course, manually all the time. So you've got to look at automation of this. And of course, you want to integrate this back into the development stack as well. And your organization may want the ability to do that in a developer world. And last time I checked, developers don't like to work in workflows. They like to work in a CLI or a CLI environment where your ops might want to work in a graphical user interface environment. Both are cool. Both are good. The reality of it is you want to provide people to work in the context of the environment that's relevant to them, because that will drive more productivity. So as you package everything, one of the features of that is you're going to get a complete release history and complete audit history of everything you deploy. So if I look at a typical scaled agile development, and a lot of people are using the scaled agile framework now, or SAFe for short, or less, or best, or something like that. And if you look at these frameworks, what you're going to have as you go through the coding exercise is typically you're going to have a couple of versions or a couple of instances, and you'll take it through and you'll do unit testing and you'll build them, and then you'll get a release candidate. And you'll push that release candidate through to your testing environment, and maybe it makes it through and you've got a minimum viable product or an MVP, and maybe you push that right through, and then ultimately you package it with all its components and test it and then deploy it. Now, in terms of doing this, one of the things that we need for our audit purposes today in highly regulated industries, and I would argue that regulation's only going to get more complex, not less, is you need a complete audit trail. One of the things you need to do is be able to understand that complete audit trail and document that complete audit trail. I believe, in short, you need to package everything so that you can understand what's there. Even in the world of containers, which is emerging now. If you look at containers and microservices, as you package microservices, you package them together in a collective group. You've got to deploy them, you've got to build a deploy of them, and you've got to deploy and scale. It's important that you actually understand the packaging aspects of them so that you can do that in a manner that makes sense. So at Forrester, we looked at tools to do the things we've talked about, release automation. And in terms of that release automation, we actually completed an assessment of 15. There's actually significantly more products in the industry than these 15, but we took the 15 products that we see the most, the 15 most prolific products, and we actually put them through a wave. You can download that wave and look at that wave criteria. And one of the things that I suggest you do as you look at these tools is the Forrester Wave also gives you the ability to download an Excel spreadsheet as well if you're a Forrester customer. And if you look at that spreadsheet, you can see our guess or our determination of the weightings. But what you might want to do is you might want to change those weightings based on what you see so that you can actually change it to suit your own environment. And that will then re-represent the vendors for you based on where you see it. So let me move on very quickly from there to metrics. And metrics are a big area right now. And Tim already hinted at this earlier in the webinar. Tim talked about the fact that we are seeing more and more organizations now really ask for metrics that make sense, metrics that are really linking back organizational value back to the work or the code we actually do. And I think that's a key aspect in terms of what we're going to deliver now. We need to start linking back the work we do, the deploys we do, the new features and functions we do back to organizational value and construct. We need to be communicating to the business how quickly and frequently we deploy. And metrics are a really interesting one. So the first metric I love, and I love this straight out of the State of DevOps Report 2017. And, one of the things is high-performing teams love automation. I believe if you want to be high-performing, you've got to really understand what automation is, how to leverage automation, how to push automation through the life cycle. And if you do this, and doing this, the first value point is back, you get time. You get time back to allow those resources to be reallocated and really do value adding. They're not just doing the same thing, building the paper plane over and over again. If you think about what we do in IT, we're about delivering business value. We're about adding value. We're about driving innovation, driving differentiation, driving success of our business. And this is what we do in terms of what we're looking to do. So automation will allow you to remove that mundane work and give your people more challenging tasks to do, adding more value across the organization, deploying more change quickly. And then the other thing we see in terms of businesses is not only are they doing that, we are also seeing organizations grow market share. One of the great things I see in the industry is an example, and I know Tim will give another one in a moment, but an example I saw in one organization is by implementing DevOps, they actually reduced the number of customer defects that were being found. So we call that defects in the wild now. They reduced defects in the wild from, at one stage, almost 100% to 7%. And by measuring defects in the wild, they actually had a tangible metric that they could go back to their business with. And defects being discovered before they got in the wild also equated in developer productivity. New features and functions, new options, new solutions being able to be delivered to their business. And that was pretty exciting for me, because what they actually found was because they discovered all these defects through the development process. When they deployed, they were deploying with less defects, which meant the development teams were working on less rework. So this has a wonderful therapeutic view. It actually gives you a higher value, higher velocity, and at the same time gives you more time back to actually drive more change. So Tim, let me hand over to you for a couple of words.
Yeah, so again, we're huge fans of this notion of metrics and measuring and understanding the impact that being able to scale these processes is having. I do encourage folks to go back and look up the webinar that we had with Nicole Forsgren, and I've given a couple of talks on DevOps metrics. One thing, though, that I find and that I've experienced myself as I'm talking to customers is our data is often spread out, right? So we have information coming from all of these different parts of our process, and figuring out where is the meaning in all of that can be, extremely difficult. So, new capability that we're adding to the XebiaLabs platform is really going into this DevOps intelligence sort of approach, right? Where what we're trying to do is focus on goals-based insight into what's happening in your process. So instead of pulling in data from a number of different systems and looking at individual numbers that may or may not reflect the overall impact of the system, our approach is to say, well, what are you trying to accomplish? What are the goals that you're trying to achieve with your process? This could be improving quality or reducing cycle time. And then we allow you to consolidate the data that can help paint the picture of your progress towards success in that goal. So this could be coming from your CI process, from your agile planning tools, from your source control system, from your deployment automation, release orchestration system. So we allow you to pull that all in together and really start to understand more about the impact that your process is having, rather than just give you a bunch of random numbers. We find that having this goal-based approach is a much better way to align what you need to measure, how you're measuring it, and ultimately what the impact for your business is. So a little bit more detail of this is going to be coming up in a subsequent webinar. I think that's coming in just a couple more weeks, so we'll watch for that and be happy to share more details at that time.
Thanks, thanks very much. So I just want to end this part before we go to questions and answers, Q&A. So get those questions fired up for us. We're happy and willing to take them. I really want to go for where we are. So in terms of scaling DevOps, there's a couple of things. I talked about them before. I mean, traditionally you're going to, first you're going to look at the process holistically. At the end of the day, the objective is to get business transformation, and driving business transformation, we're going to do it by moving into smaller change sets and smaller change pieces. This is a key part of what we do and how we're going to do it. We're going to transition that change by automating the pipeline. What we're going to do is look at how our pipeline works. We're going to look at the steps involved. We're going to implement things like effective testing, and we're going to have automated testing. We're going to implement the use of release packages and deploy to production. But all of that in an automated manner. All of that without metrics, where we understand metrics and value, is actually not going to be successful. We need to measure the things that make sense. So one of the things organizations start with is they're going to measure their change deploy rate. As you get better at measuring your change deploy rate and change frequency, of course you're going to get better at quality. If you're not getting better at quality, then you need to go back and look at the process. But another aspect of scaling it is really about empowering people. We haven't talked about it a lot, and I know Nicole Forsgren talks about this a lot, is you need to empower people, you need to trust people, you need to support a culture of experimentation. You need to support the capability to experiment and trial, and you also need to trust. And one of the things I see in DevOps initiatives going to scale is you've got to allow a bit of flexibility for people to learn a little bit. One of the things I love is this caring and sharing culture. So what do I mean by caring and sharing? So one of the things is I mentioned product teams before, where you have the security people come in. What's really interesting, once a team understands the implications of security and how to embed security and how to do security by design rather than by security by add-on afterwards, you actually get more secure code. And you can validate that in testing. By putting the right testing in place, you can ensure that what you do and how you do it is done well. Now, aspects of other things there is you're empowering people. Allow them to experiment, allow them to identify new process, allow them to communicate and collaborate. And over time, those teams will become consistent in terms of their use of products and tools. We talk about marketing wins. One of the things that grows success is more success. And I think you need, and communicated success, you need to articulate your wins. You need to articulate your learnings. You need to share the use cases where you went down a fork in the road that didn't work and you have to backtrack. Let the people know, let the team know. Share that information. Put it out there and show it so that people can actually learn from it, because learning allows the ability for people to make decisions. I had on a call earlier today talking to an organization about DevOps culture, and they said we've got two choices. We can impose process and standards, or we can have people choose to use them. If you can work with your team and have them choose to use them, you will get far better adoption and use. And you're going to do that by making it easy and delivering them the capabilities they want in the context they want. So as you can see, my little loop on the right doesn't look like the usual DevOps loop. And I believe that we are well beyond DevOps. We are now seeing DevOps become what we call Biz DevOps. And we do that because we are going to be delivering automated process flows so that once a piece of code is pushed, it will be automatically tested, automatically validated, automatically packaged, and automatically deployed. We're going to help people actually drive that by giving them the pipeline so they don't need to worry about it. One of the things once you've given them an automated pipeline is they'll become more productive sooner and faster. So that's really where I start. Tim, any thoughts before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what we're seeing as well, right? So it's beyond this question of simply figuring out what are the pieces to automate and should we automate or not, and calling it a day with that, but really thinking about this broader impact and how it drives everything in the business.
That is awesome. So with that said, let's go to questions Q&A.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rob. This is great content here that really wraps up in a nice package a lot of the concepts that we've been exploring in the last couple of months about how to get teams on board and motivate people to make these changes. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through. I'll lob a couple of them out, and then Rob, we can certainly go back and forth. One question here. The viewer said, I read that all new features that Facebook plans to release in the next 6 months are already deployed to production. How do they achieve this? So, I don't know specifically about Facebook and how much of their features are already in production, but I think there's some interesting things that we can maybe touch on here with dark launches and some of the ways that automated deployment can help you get ahead of this and play around with production and rolling things out. Thoughts, Rob?
Yeah. So dark launching is dark launching, and there's other words for it, right? And we're seeing this as a more and more of a common approach that's used for deployment today. So if I kind of articulate it, there may be one or two on the call that aren't aware of it. So in the past, we've pretty much done coding, and as we deploy that code, the features are immediately available, right? And dark launching typically uses the concept of toggle switches, where once a change is deployed to production, the features are left in a off position until a business person turns them on. And I'm highly summarizing dark launching here. And then at that point in time, once the business determines that feature is ready for use, they typically will flip the switch. And what they'll do is they'll typically flip it on a small subset of users to validate its use. Now, the reality of that is that it requires a complete coding methodology. Although many tools in the market can support it, it requires a different coding methodology in terms of how we go about coding, and it requires the business discipline to vigorously validate that the feature, once turned on, is fit for purpose and fit for use. But it also has the advantage that the feature doesn't work properly, you can turn it off, and then you can put it back through an R&D cycle to fix it again. So that's kind of the notion of that. And Tim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely for me, thinking about all of these different techniques, canary deployments and blue-green and dark launches and all of these sorts of new ways that we can deliver that value and phase the release to customers so that we can control some of these things. It gives us control on those feedback loops and rolling back, as you said. But none of that would have been possible in the past without a good quality process of automating your deployment, right? If we were back in the old days of fully manual deployments where people had to move, set up environments and move code in and out, there's no way you could play with this, and there's no way you could make some functionality available to a subset of your users to get instant feedback. It just wouldn't be possible. So with a good process and a good deployment automation approach, it really opens all of these things up. So you don't necessarily need to do dark launches, or you don't necessarily need to be embracing all of these techniques. But by having this solid foundation of automation and tools that can roll back changes to production and automate them and make it self-service so developers can have ways to bring their code to production faster, gives you the flexibility to explore some of these techniques as ways to validate the value that you're bringing to the market. So whether or not dark launches are right for your organization, they might be for Facebook, they might not be for your enterprise, at least you have the flexibility to consider them if you want to, by having that solid foundation.
Very good.
Okay, I'm going to tap back into the questions here. So, one of the things that has occurred to me as we're talking about scaling, right, was you mentioned this notion already, Rob, about developers wanting to approach things in a developer-centric way, and operations people maybe wanting to approach it with with tools that are more like theirs. So. What have you been seeing around the sort of code-centric approach to things? I know you mentioned CLI. We have a lot of our customers that want to represent those artifacts that are parts of their process in code, because it does give them the benefits that they get from doing other things with code, right? So reuse, management, peer code review, and that as a training option. Is that something that you continue to see as a trend as well?
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the things as we shift the release. And by the way, that is a sign that we are successful in building release packages. As we shift it left, as developers want to package the release and include and use the CLIs, and both CLIs and the reuse and use of APIs too is another aspect that's supporting this as well. So I believe we're starting to see that trend happen. In fact, we're even in terms of our ops people, we're starting to see a better use of code and the ability to use at least DSLs to represent and develop infrastructure as code, and the ability to ensure that it can be implemented as code. We're starting to see the ability to drive and construct middleware with CLIs as well. So we are clearly seeing this trend happen now where we're seeing the release shift across primarily to CLIs, and we're seeing that to be an equal partner in terms of building. Now, you hinted that, or alluded to the fact that ops people might want to build in terms of an ops or a workflow or a GUI that the ops people have. And by the way, one of the things we're starting to see is as you can build these workflows in operational flows in a GUI, you can actually then articulate those same process flows in a CLI and hand those CLIs over as artifacts. One of the things we recommend at Forrester is that all artifacts that deploy and are all treated as code and end up in your repo and are managed as code. And I think that's just good practice. The more you do that, the more you have your deployment methodologies as code in a repo that you call, represented however you wish. That is just strategic. So I think we're going to see more of that. And the more adoption of containers, we're going to see even more of it going forward. So I believe this is the beginning of another shift in the industry.
Yeah, and that's certainly been our experience within our own platform, within the XebiaLabs product. Our DSLs represented in both worlds, right? So we do believe that some folks want to be entirely code-centric and build their process around managing that as a code artifact. But then other people may want to view it, even if it's in process, through a visual tool. So that's been our approach. We allow you to, author visually and export to a code artifact, or write a code artifact and then be able to view that in flight via a UI and so forth. So we find that not restricting your team to one or the other approach is really the best. And again, to touch on the shortage of people who are skilled in this space, by not closing the door to people who are more code-centric or less code-centric, you're going to find more talent within your organization that can contribute to making a good process work regardless of their backgrounds.
Yeah, we totally agree on that one. That's for sure.
Great. So interesting question here on, since we're still on the BizDev slide, a viewer wrote in, in this this vector of DevOps to BizDevOps, this culture and mindset can certainly be extended outside of the software dev release. So what are you seeing emerge beyond DevOps, and sort of who are the leaders there? It's interesting from an organizational perspective of starting to pull in the business, I would imagine, right, Rob?
Yeah, so we've started to see an interesting change in the market right now, because one of the things that if you look at some of the original thought leaders of DevOps, you talk to people like a large bank in the Netherlands that is an early advocate of DevOps, and their CEO Ralph Hammers. He talks a lot about the fact that DevOps is the tool or the fuel that drives the business forward, and there's no reason why the business can't actually quickly push directly through changes. And with low-code, no-code solutions, we're starting to see more of that happen where the business is driving the change. And this really requires us to have our process in place. I think you talked about it. You articulated earlier in the call. As you've got your process in place, the automation in place, that means that people don't need to worry about the process. They can do the change and push it. And because we've got great testing in place and great validation and great release, it can automatically go through the whole process. I think this is where we need to transform to. and we need to transform quite quickly. So as we go forward, we are seeing DevOps process be used primarily in organizations, especially in their marketing organizations already, where not all of them are maybe represented as, or realize it's DevOps, but that's exactly what they're doing in building marketing campaigns and driving marketing campaigns. We're seeing organizations drive additional features as well from other areas of their business, you know, such as HR is looking at one organization I know I've been talking to, their HR organization is now using DevOps methodologies to actually roll out new changes to their HR systems, so on and so forth. So you are absolutely correct. This has widespread use outside. Take the technology stack away or the technology discussion away, but the process has widespread use in and out of IT. Because it's all fueled by IT, we better get the process right, and that's the key step.
Yes, ultimately, you know, anything from the moment you have an idea until that idea is delivered to your user or customer or whoever it is waste, right? So whether that's a new idea for how to streamline your HR process, or whether that's an idea of how to launch a social media campaign or deliver a piece of software, everyone will benefit from reducing that wasteful time in the middle. And the shorter you can get from that moment of idea of value to that value in the hands of your user or customer is going to be a benefit. And so we've been fortunate in IT in the last 10 years to be developing these techniques. So if we can share those with other parts of the business, everyone's going to benefit. So let me throw one last piece out on, you know, we've been painting a rather rosy picture, I think, Rob, with this, but we know things go wrong, right? You know, so we touched on this a little bit with dark launches and the ability to roll things back, but, you know, what are your thoughts on sort of DevOps, and does it, you know, how does it impact our ability to understand when problems happen and understand root cause analysis, as well as sort of just rolling things back?
Wow, we asked this question last. Probably need a whole hour on it. You know, DevOps, I think fundamentally, and the short answer, and then I'll leave you a minute to summarize too. The short answer is it gives us great visibility. I love DevOps because actually when you see failure, because you're automating the failure, you're keeping all the data, you can relate the failure back exactly to the change. You know what it is, it's smaller change. It actually helps dramatically in terms of understanding, and I'll call it a defect because I'm trying to get that word widely used. You can then understand that defect, the failure can then lead to the defect. You'll know where that defect is, and you can immediately go back and triage. And even more importantly, the value of DevOps is if you release in an automated and structured way, you can fall back immediately to the previous known good. And I love that while you go and do the triage. So you can actually immediately fall back, immediately be productive, and immediately give back the input on the defect back to the team so that they can resolve it quite quickly.
Yeah, and that touches to your great earlier point about the culture of experimentation and investigation, and giving people the freedom and the power to take some chances and be innovative and drive their business that way. And if you have this good platform behind you where you know, you're not paying a penalty every time you want to try out new value for your market, you're going to create a culture that's more innovative and make you lead the competition. So for me, you know, ultimately that's what we're here for, is to get value to the market more rapidly. So great. Well, I think that's brought us up to the top of the hour. Rob, it's always really a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insight of the market with the folks today. We look forward to putting this recording up and continuing the conversation on our webinars page through our Twitter handle and the like.
Thanks, and for some reason I think I'm a bit passionate about this topic, so thanks for having me.
Good enough. All right, and then we look forward to everyone joining us next month for more on this, including on the DevOps insight and analytics that I hinted to earlier on. So for Tim Buntel at XebiaLabs, thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.